Welcome to this new LRB Close Readings series about political poems. We have a new format for our new series. In these conversations, we'll be taking each time a single poem, one which has been understood and admired, or perhaps criticised, for its politics, or for its particular engagement with contemporary political history. And as ever, we shall be enlightened and informed by pieces to be found in the rich gathering of essays and reviews that make up the archive of the London Review of Books. My name is Seamus Perry, and I teach English literature at Balliol College in Oxford, and I'm talking to Mark Ford, poet, critic, and professor of English at University College London. And the poem we've chosen for our first conversation in this series is Andrew Marvell's Horatian Ode, which is, as Frank Kermode says in a piece he contributes to the London Review of Books, a text that it's possible to think the greatest political poem in the language. Mark, so we're starting at the top.
Yes, and it's political in all senses of the word, isn't it? I mean, the full title, An Horatian Ode upon Cromwell's return from Ireland, gives us the moment in history. It was written in summer, probably June of 1650, and King Charles had been executed in January of the previous year, 1649, and Cromwell later in 1649 had gone to Ireland and subdued the Irish. By subdued, I mean massacred, really disastrously violent campaign. And the poem actually talks about the kind of his battles against the Irish, and somewhat implausibly has the Irish admiring Cromwell and commending him for his victory over them. And Cromwell returns in May 30th, I think it is, from Ireland to England, and is within a couple of years has become a sort of the de facto king. So the kind of turbulence which Marvell lived through, he was 29 when he wrote it, and over the next 20 years, the turbulence is just unbelievable. And this poem is a political poem, but it's interesting in that it doesn't make much impact on the politics of the time because it was unpublished. It may have been circulated in manuscript to a few choice readers, but there's no certainty that it was. And when Marvell's collected poems, or his posthumous volumes, came out in 1681, it was the time of the Restoration, and the publisher excised it at the last moment. So it's only in a couple of copies does it exist in the 1681. So it's not until 1776, the kind of the year of the American War of Independence, that this poem is published properly. So it doesn't intervene in the politics of the time, but it registers them with a kind of subtlety and a delicacy and an intriguing ambiguity which makes it both about politics but also political, because no one can agree the extent to which Marvell is celebrating the arrival of Cromwell or deploring the death of Charles, or both at the same time.
Yes, so that's the thing I suppose we'll probably concentrate on, isn't it? Which is that the poem has a radical kind of ambiguity about it, which obviously Kermode admired and liked. We should say maybe one or two things additionally about the context to it. Cromwell's campaign in Ireland was brutal. The person that Marvell is welcoming back is someone who led an extraordinarily bloody campaign in Ireland, which effectively had the ideology of a crusade, because it was not only against Irish people who were being rebellious against the new regime, it was also against Catholics who, Cromwell thought were heretics. So it had that whole kind of crusading kind of violence about it. And I suppose the other thing that we ought to mention is that what's going to happen next is Cromwell's going to invade Scotland.
Yes. It's a crisis poem. I mean, it is an absolute crisis poem in every way. Probably the greatest crisis that the English has suffered in terms of its own internal conflicts, undoubtedly the case. And in terms of the religious aspect, it is an intriguing paradox, sort of slightly gestured towards in the poem, that Cromwell, whose the notion of Cromwell as being divinely elected, as somehow being God's chosen instrument to effect this change and to abolish what had been sort of centuries of monarchy as they thought forever, was also someone who Marvell worried might not allow the amount of religious freedom to which Marvell was committed. And I think there's one piece in which Blair Warden is quoted as saying the language of the poem is almost bipolar, that it can be read on two levels at once, and it's impossible to adjudicate between the two. But I think that's probably the point of the language, in that Marvell is recovering a sense of privacy and individual subjectivity and a sense of autonomy for the reader of the poem and for himself in the process of writing the poem, as these two really kind of determined power blocks, the kind of the royalists who were still adhering to the royalist cause, and the Cromwell's new interregnum Puritan vision of England can kind of collide together or coexist together. And the poem allows us to kind of juggle between them in a way which is analogous to I think that's the way we respond to news so much these days, political news. You think on the one hand this, on the other hand that.
Yes.
And this poem superbly captures that sense of ambivalence and uncertainty. But at least it does so in a manner that allows us to feel we're having our own thoughts and we're not being invaded by ideologies which we feel resistant to.
Yes, what Blair Wharton says in his LRB piece are bitterly divided feelings about the whole paradox of a Cromwellian kingship, which Wharton thinks Marvell spots on the horizon, and perhaps that's something that we might come back to later on in our conversation. One last detail, I suppose, about the context of the poem. It's very difficult to date lots and lots of Marvell's poems. The date of this one seems less problematic because of the occasion that prompts it. And by this time, Marvell is absolutely part of the household of Fairfax, who had been head of the Republican Army. But when the Scottish invasion happens, he steps down because he doesn't think the Scottish invasion is justified any more than he thinks that the trial and execution of the king was quite the right thing to do. And so Cromwell then steps in. And the important thing about Fairfax, from our point of view, is that Marvell is part of the Fairfax household. He's the tutor to Fairfax's daughter. And Fairfax is an extraordinarily interesting figure, isn't he? Because he's part of the New Model Army. He's the leader of it until Cromwell takes over. But he's also part of the group of MPs that welcome Charles II back into England when the Restoration happens in 1660. So if you wanted someone who absolutely kind of encapsulated or embodied all the complexities and the contradictions of mid-17th century English politics, Fairfax is the man, and Marvell is his laureate.
And of course, the poems he writes about Appleton House are poems of rural retreat often, or that they have a kind of pastoral element to them. They're saturated in politics, of course, but that they are set in kind of rural, idyllic retreats. And the first lines of this poem say this is exactly what the Marvell must now give up, that the crisis of the time means the forward youth that would appear must now forsake his muses dear, nor in the shadows sing his numbers languishing. 'Tis time to leave the books in dust and oil the unused armour's rust, removing from the wall the corslet of the hall. So he's paradoxically writing a poem about saying you shouldn't write poems anymore.
That's right. Absolutely.
And you should be a man of action. And of course, it's difficult for someone of Marvell's unbelievably sophisticated cast of mind to commit to any particular action, that he is a brilliantly indecisive poet in the ways in which someone like T.S. Eliot commended in 1921. And you can see that Marvell in some ways is a prefigurer of Prufrock in his ability to see all sides of a topic and not to decide between them. But he is saying that this forward youth who would appear, i.e. make some kind of name for himself, and Marvell did become a politician. He was MP for Hull for many decades, though he was notoriously loath to speak. He didn't enjoy public speaking. So the sense in which he was a public man and writing a public poem, but his own sense of his privacy, and I think the poem in some ways does embody his own private ways of making sense of what's happening at the time, is dramatised in these opening lines, that he should come forward and not languishing, as I was reading, that languishing has a sort of royalist connotations, that the old and this is where the Horatian bit has also got a royalist connotations, the idea of this rural retreat which one would enjoy in Horatian mode under a just ruler, a king of some kind. These are the things that must be abandoned, and you must become a warrior of some kind and take down your armour and somehow contribute to the cause.
Yes, take down the armour that's been decorating your hallway in a kind of curatorial way, and put it on and use it in some more active way. Yes, it's interesting, those two opening stanzas that you've just quoted, because there is clearly an analogy being put forward by Marvell between the forward youth that he's describing there and Cromwell, because the third verse begins, "So restless Cromwell could not cease in the inglorious arts of peace." And this introduces something which I'm sure we'll be talking about throughout our conversation about this poem, which is the way that a lot of the key words that are apparently epithets of praise actually also have an odd kind of ambiguity which implies something pejorative or morally dubious about them. And the second word of the poem already contains that, doesn't it? Forward. I mean, forward could mean urgent and ambitious, but it could equally mean something a little bit more morally critical, couldn't it? It could mean pushy, it could mean overly ambitious. And that kind of double speak, as Blair Worton says, and you quoted a moment ago, this whole kind of bipolarity about some of the key epithets in this poem, that's established from the very beginning, isn't it?
Yes, and is embodied in the poem's form as well, which has these kind of octosyllabic couplets, 8-syllable couplets, followed by a 6-syllable couplet. This seesawing is going on all the time. On the one hand this, on the other hand that. And a word like inglorious, in the inglorious arts of peace. Well, you're bound to think about, are the arts of peace inglorious? Yes. Obviously, they don't lead to military glory, no. But is that the only kind of glory, one value? So every word has a kind of buzzer underneath it saying that something odd is going on, or that this can be taken different ways. And I think this applies to all the Roman allusions that go on as well. So it's not only a Horatian Ode, but Caesar and Hannibal are invoked. And Cromwell is compared to Hannibal, and that's a fairly divisive thing to do because Hannibal didn't conquer. He didn't conquer the Romans. So I think Marvell, on the one hand, seems to be celebrating Cromwell's possible invasion of Europe, or saying that this revolution which has happened in England can then be exported to Italy and to France. But whether or not Marvell actually thinks that's a good thing is something we just can't adjudicate on, I think.
Yes, perhaps before moving on through the poem, we should say a word about Horace and the Horatian, which clearly Marvell is flagging in his title. And Horace seems to be a kind of parallel for Marvell, doesn't he? Because Horace was a Republican, but comes round to accepting and indeed celebrating the rule of Augustus as an emperor. And that is very roughly the trajectory of Marvell's own life, isn't it? So as a very young man, as an undergraduate at Cambridge, he publishes a poem which is a version of one of Horace's odes that celebrates Charles I as our Caesar. And in this poem, Horatian Ode that we're talking about today, he seems to be revisiting that, and then in this very complicated, emotionally rather nuanced way and ideologically nuanced way that we're talking about, seems to be reworking that Latin parallel, that Roman parallel.
Yes, and there's another Italian writer who's pertinent, that's Machiavelli, and Marvell was attacked as a Machiavellian-style figure, and Machiavelli talked about the new prince, the novus princeps, and Cromwell would be this kind of new prince. And Machiavelli was a sort of, again, a double-sided figure. And I suppose in terms of the historical or political view of this poem, and I think this is something that may come up in the course, to what extent it somehow is going along with the inevitable force of history. Yeah. That there's this very, very, very plangent account and moving account of Charles's death, but is Marvell saying that the forces of history have somehow outdated Charles I, and that he is a kind of an aesthete and a gracious person, but is somehow doomed by the forces of history which are moving in a different direction, and those forces are determined by some kind of divine power. But is that divine power, and Cromwell is the vehicle or the means for that divine power to fulfill its mission, but that is also a kind of fairly distressing series of events unfold from that.
Let's look at the way that Cromwell is represented in his first appearances in the poem. He's a kind of Superman, isn't he? He's someone who has a kind of power which is partly the force of nature, but partly even more than that. He's kind of like a sort of supernatural, isn't he? Through adventurous war urged his active star. which is, one of these wonderful ambiguities that we've mentioned already. Does that mean that his active star, that's to say his destiny, urges him through adventurous war, or is it Cromwell that's doing the urging? In which case it turns him into this extraordinary figure that actually dictates or determines the course of providence. And then later, the next stanza, like the three-forked lightning, first breaking the clouds where it was nursed, did thorough his own side, his fiery way divide. This is associating Cromwell with a kind of satanic imagery, isn't it, of fieriness and forcefulness.
Yes, it reminds one of Satan in Paradise Lost. Milton and Marvell were close friends, and Marvell introduced Paradise Lost. So I think Cromwell is a figure whom he, to some extent, in the 1850s did come to support, and he did have a position as kind of secretary within the Cromwell's government. But a lot of violence is associated with Cromwell. As you said, the Irish campaign was particularly violent, and this is also the forces of imperialism beginning to expand and the connection with the Roman Empire. He compares him, and Caesar's head at last did through his laurels blast. That seems to be associating. Caesar's head there is Charles, isn't it?
That's Charles, yes, that's right. There's a little contest in the poem about who is most like Caesar. Yeah. Is it Charles or is it Cromwell? And they're like different aspects of Caesar, aren't they? I mean, this is the Caesar who's assassinated.
Yes. This is the inevitability aspect of the poem. 'Tis madness to resist or blame the force of angry heaven's flame.
Yes.
So you can, on one level, you can read that as saying this is the inevitable processes of historical progress. On the other hand, you can see this almost in inverted commas, that there's no way that somebody who could possibly resist this, because they'll get in trouble if they do.
Absolutely. Yes, exactly. So there is an appeal to historical inevitability, isn't there, as a 20th century person in the Marxist tradition might say. Or someone in the 17th century like Milton might appeal to necessity. But that is, as Milton says, the tyrant's plea. Yes. Necessity, the tyrant's plea. So there's a very, very murky kind of ambiguous moral world that these different terms and these different references are inhabiting, isn't there? Cromwell is described as someone who from his private gardens, where he lived reserved and austere, as if his highest plot to plant the bergamot, which I gather was a particularly delicious kind of pear, could by industrious valour climb to ruin the great work of time. And that's fascinating, isn't it, within the context of Marvell's own poetry? Because the private garden is, of course, exactly what he celebrates himself in one of his greatest poems, The Garden, which is probably written within a few months or a few years of the Horatian Ode. And the opening of the garden, how vainly men themselves amaze to win the palm, the oak, or bays. This kind of worldly ambition is vain, it's pointless, and yet that's exactly what he's saying Cromwell is so good for having turned his back on the world of the garden.
Yes, and it seems, and this is, I guess, to show our listeners that we're up on kind of historicist readings of the poem, that bergamot was actually associated with royalism.
I did not know that.
It's yes, it was considered to be the pear of kings.
Ah.
So when Cromwell is leaving his bergamot, there may be some kind of irony in which a royalist fruit is being implanted in Cromwell's garden, which may suggest his own regal ambitions. So the kind of multivalence of the ironies, which kind of make every single phrase of this poem so kind of calculating and intriguing and difficult to parse, doesn't impede its great forward drive. It's a terrific narrative poem, as well as an extremely sophisticated poem about the politics of language and the politics of the particular crisis which it is describing. But we do get this kind of multifaceted portrait of Cromwell, and we get this. I mean, one of the most moving passages, I think, in all literature is the death of King Charles, who's presented as on a stage. And it's interesting to think that how often the deaths, executions of kings have been represented on the Elizabethan and Jacobean stages in the decades preceding the Civil War. That was what nearly all tragedies ended up with, the death of a king. But Charles is presented as embracing his death as a superbly composed and moving and dignified actor. He's chased to the Isle of Wight, and Carisbrooke is and this is seen as Cromwell's own kind of devious plot has kind of trapped Charles into his web or net, I think is the word that the poem uses. He wove a net of such a scope that Charles himself might chase to Carisbrooke's narrow case. And then Charles is brought to London and executed, that thence the royal actor born the tragic scaffold might adorn, while round the armoured bands did clap their bloody hands. He nothing common did or mean upon that memorable scene, but with his keener eye the axe's edge did try, nor called the gods with vulgar spite to vindicate his helpless right, but bowed his comely head down as upon a bed.
Yes. So, I mean, the admiration for Cromwell in the poem is, as we've been saying, is extraordinarily nuanced and edged. But it would seem to me, at least, thinking about the stanzas you've just read out there, that the more humanly scaled feelings in the poem, I mean, not the feelings about the Superman, but the more humanly scaled feelings are absolutely on Charles's side. This could be a little royalist poem embedded within what is attempting to be a Republican poem.
Absolutely. I suppose the counter-argument would be that by giving Charles his due, one somehow moves on from royalism, that somehow this is the equivalent to the ways in which, say, someone like Cooper laments the last of the Mohicans. They're doomed to die, give them a glowing and glorious tragic end, and then let's move on with a Republican future. I suppose that would be the Republican argument that you get in the work of critics such as David Norbrooke, who writes a brilliant piece in the LRB about Marvell, and who's a wonderfully astute explicator of Marvell, but does see him as, in this poem, committing himself to republicanism. It's for him a kind of transition poem from royalism to republicanism, or lukewarm royalism to lukewarm republicanism.
Yes. He nothing common did or mean is interesting, isn't it? It's one of these poems that is so attentive to the different spins of individual words, isn't it? And then a little bit later on, we hear that Cromwell has to the common feet presented Ireland as a kind of gift or a kind of act of generosity. So the fact that Charles didn't do something common might, in its own ambivalent way, be a sign that he wasn't quite on the right side, because being in tune with the common actually was a sign that you were properly Republican, I suppose.
Yes, it is an aristocrat versus kind of bourgeois poem, and this is what's happening in this particular age. I love the sort of pun that you get, but with his keener eye did the axe's edge did try, which is somewhere where you can see the kind of metaphysical aspects of kind of Marvell's readings in Donne and Herbert and so on, that kind of witty conceit. But he's doing it for a real person at a real time in a real place, and there's something absolutely magnificent about it. I think this must have caught Eliot's eye, who writes a wonderful essay on Marvell in 1921, and who in Little Gidding celebrates the royalist cause, or laments the defeat of the royalist cause. And Charles becomes in these lines a kind of martyr, the kind of martyr of who would live on through the centuries.
Yes, and also keener than whom? I mean, presumably keener than everyone else who's there. I mean, he knows what's going on. He knows the significance of what's happening.
I thought it was keener than the axe's edge.
Okay.
So it was
another ambiguity, you might say.
Keener than even the axe which is about to chop his head off is his eye. And there's this peculiar conceit that follows, derived from an episode in Livy, whereby the head found when the Romans are building the Capitol first time signifies a good fortune. They find a head, but it's not a bleeding head in Livy. That's transposed by Marvell.
Is Marvell's invention, absolutely. So that's the brilliant set piece execution scene in the middle, where he imagines, again by another ambiguity, the people with bloody hands around the scaffold clapping. I think as a historical detail, they were clapping to drown out what the king was trying to say as his death oration, but by the grace of the theatrical metaphors that Marvell is using, it turns into applause for what the king is doing, which is a lovely, wonderful touch. But then, as we get into the later stanzas, we turn to very recent politics, don't we? Not the execution of Charles, but much more recent politics, which is the Irish and what Cromwell has done there. And now the Irish are ashamed to see themselves in 1 year tamed. So much one man can do that does both act and know. So he's developing a kind of great man theory of politics, isn't he, here? This is almost like a sort of proto-Thomas Carlyle hero worship. And indeed, Cromwell was one of Carlyle's heroes. That kind of notion of how politics works and where it comes from. It doesn't come from ideas. It doesn't come from political settlements of a consensual or agreed kind. It comes from a great man doing something.
Yes, and this is the historical consciousness of the poem in action, because Charles had invaded Ireland himself in the 1630s, disastrously.
Yes.
So Cromwell gets the job done.
One of the few things that Charles and Parliament agree about is that you should invade Ireland.
Cromwell gets the job done, but to get the job done does require brutality. And I think one of the strengths of it as a political poem is its refusal to gloss the ghastliness of what's going on. That it may be making use of the genre of the panegyric, which is celebrating someone, but it inverts it in a very kind of clever and subversive way. And one wondered what Cromwell would have made of it. Because Marvell did write some subsequent panegyrics for Cromwell, which went down quite well, as I understand it.
And they seem completely unambivalent.
Yes.
They seem absolutely, just praising Stalin, really.
So the fact that this was unpublished and in some ways is unpublishable, one might imagine that it would not satisfy any of the parties involved, is in some ways an aspect of what poetry can do. Poetry can create this reserved plot, to use the poem's own terms, in which one's own doubts, dilemmas, emotions, anxieties, contradictions can be acted out or written out in a way which is, I wouldn't say uplifting exactly, but in a sense does justice to the complexity of the situation, resisting propaganda, although it makes use of many propaganda terms. And clever historicist critics have picked up all the phrases from pamphlets, which Marvell has incorporated into the poem and re-embedded it in its kind of historical moment and in the writing of the moment, which was mainly the writing of ephemeral pamphlets. And Marvell himself wrote quite a few of them.
Yes, and the sort of animal violence, the almost sort of Ted Hughes-like violence involved here is perfectly captured, isn't it, in the extended metaphor of the falcon. So when the falcon high falls heavy from the sky, she, this is a brilliant little parenthesis, isn't it, having killed, no more to search, but on the next green bough to perch, where, when he first does lure, the falconer has her sure. And the falconer there is, I don't know, the people or the House of Commons or something like that. And it has somehow managed to.
But does she?
Exactly, to bring back the falcon who has killed. And then another classical, and you've mentioned this already, a Caesar he ere long to Gaul. So of course Caesar is famous for conquering Gaul and contributing it to the Roman Empire, to Italy and Hannibal. And as you say, that is a very odd allusion, because it's true that Hannibal successfully invades Italy and occupies the southern parts of Italy for quite a long time, but in the end he's driven out and he's defeated.
Yes.
And Caesar, of course, also is an ambivalent figure, because it's true he conquers Gaul, but then he comes back to Rome, he creates a civil war, and he turns himself into a permanent despot.
A dictator. And that's the fear that Cromwell will become that. And it's worth pointing out that Horace fought at Philippi and then goes over to Augustus. So the sense of the flip-flopping in the title is also within the allusions which Marvell sort of brilliantly configures into this. And the ending I find sort of distressing in its relentless sense of how historical inevitability involves violence. Am I reading that right, do you think?
I think so. I mean, I suppose the countervoice is the odd kind of quality of pity or sympathy that emerges in just a couple of the stanzas towards the end for the Scots, who are going to get this next, or the Picts, as he calls them. The Picts no shelter now shall find within his party-coloured mind. Happy if in the tufted brake the English hunter him mistake, nor lay his hounds in near the Caledonian deer. So he's imagining the Scots who haven't been invaded yet, and Fairfax has refused to invade them as the head of the army because he doesn't think that England has been provoked enough to do so. Cromwell has absolutely no compunction about that. He's going to get in there and beat them all up as much as he can. And Marvell is imagining them as creatures hiding from a pack of hounds. And the English hunter is also very, very striking, because I think for anyone of Marvell's readership, the hunter as a kind of mythological figure would have brought up the idea of Nimrod from the Old Testament, who was a great leader but becomes a terrible tyrant. So it's like that Caesar illusion, isn't it? It's an illusion which is at once glorifying but also has a kind of undercurrent of real moral reservation. Yes,
and the sense that Cromwell becomes a bit like Talus in Spenser's poem, this kind of, iron fist. I think it's really brilliantly caught in the line which has the longest word in the poem in it. But thou, the wars and fortune's son, march indefatigably on.
Yes.
Never has indefatigably in this very short line seems so kind of relentless and in some ways deplorable, impossible to escape, that there is some remorseless, relentless force coming on. And for the last effect, still keep thy sword erect. That it's in dispute whether he means it as a kind of sword as a cross or the sword as that to smite his enemies. But certainly it becomes smiting in the last stanza. Besides, the force it has to fright the spirits of the shady night, the same arts that did gain a power must it maintain. I think there is an allusion in the spirits of the shady night to Virgil in Book 6, down in the underworld, although it's also possibly a kind of Christian notion of that the cross will fright the spirits away. But that last couplet seems to me to sum up a political savvy poetry through the ages, that there is it's unillusioned. The same arts that did gain a power must it maintain. That there is no utopian afterlife, that you don't win these battles and afterwards everyone is happily living in their rural retreats. That there's a sense of anti-utopianism, you could say, in the poem, and a kind of, in terms of its relation to English history, almost a nostalgia for what has been lost. And the brave new world, well, it's here, it's inevitable, but one has to steel one's nerves to cope with it.
Yeah, it's that the arts of war and the arts of peace are actually the same arts, isn't it? It's a real kind of realpolitik kind of realization like that.
And then so arts become propaganda almost.
And as Eliot says in the great essay that you referred to earlier, you have a wonderful lyric grace in Marvell, but underneath it there's something really tough.
Yes.
There's something which is absolutely alive to the unforgiving truths of what politics is actually like.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mark. Next time we'll be discussing another poem which you might claim as the greatest political poem in the language, perhaps, or the second greatest, which is W.H. Auden's 1937 poem about the Spanish Civil War called Spain. We're taking a lot of the poems in this series from the Faber Book of Political Verse, which was edited by Tom Paulin, out of print now, but you may be able to find a second-hand copy. It has a very stimulating introduction by Tom and received an equally stimulating review by David Norbrook in the LRB, which provoked an extensive series of letters, and we may refer to some of that debate during the series. So it's worth taking a look at. We'll put a link to that in the description. If you enjoyed this episode, please do try signing up to the Close Reading subscription, where you'll find our full 12-part series on 19th and 20th century long poems and short stories, the long and short. And lots of other things as well. There's the full series of Medieval Beginnings with Irina Dumitrescu and Mary Wellesley, and Among the Ancients with Emily Wilson and Thomas Jones, and 3 new series running this year. On Satire with Colin Burrow and Claire Bucknell, Human Conditions with Judith Butler, Pankaj Mishra, Brent Hayes Edwards and Adam Schatz, and a second series of Among the Ancients with Emily Wilson and Thomas Jones. And even more, you can hear the first series that Mark and I did together on modern-ish poets, and listen to this series on political poems without any annoying ads. So please do give it a go. You can sign up directly in Apple Podcasts or in other podcast apps. Just follow the links in the description.